You're walking along a railroad siding. It's nearly 4 o'clock in the morning of April 30th, 1900. You're just outside of the little town of Vaughn, Mississippi. In the distance, a highballing train is approaching, but you can't hear it yet. It's trying to make up for lost time and to make its way to its destination farther south. But that train will never make it. Instead, it will make its way into history.
Come on, you rounders, if you want to hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was his name. On the icy road, he won his fame. The man called Casey about 10:30. Gotta make a run to Canton again. Mounted to the cabin with his orders in his hand. Took a farewell trip to the promised land. Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin. Took a farewell trip to the promised land. It was early morning.
The world has changed a lot in the more than 100 years since Casey Jones rode his train into history. This sleepy railroad siding where that incident happened is no longer in an isolated area. It's no longer quiet here. It's beside a busy county road and just yards from an interstate highway. Thousands pass through this area every day, not realizing that they are passing by hallowed ground. The legend of Casey Jones is known around the world, but the legend is sometimes twisted. For some, it's the story of a reckless, fast-driving railroad engineer cannonballing his train through the fog to make up for lost time with faithful assistant Sim Webb at his side. For others, it's the story of courage, the story of an affable, gregarious, 6'4" strapping railroader in his mid-late 30s who would give up his life to save the lives of others in an unavoidable railroad accident that was not of his making. For those of us who know the true story, Casey Jones is truly an American hero. On the 100th anniversary of Casey's final trip, hundreds gathered in Jackson, Tennessee, Casey's home at the time, to hear the music, to listen to the old story being retold, and to visit with some of Casey's descendants. I had the pleasure of emceeing part of that ceremony, so stick around. We'll hear what went on that day. We'll hear from Casey's granddaughter and his great-grandson. We'll hear some interesting variations on the Ballad of Casey Jones, and a lot more. The master of ceremonies for the 100th anniversary of Casey Jones' ride at the Casey Jones Village and Old Country Store in Jackson, Tennessee, was a man synonymous with that complex, a second-generation co-owner, Clark Shaw.
We are very, very, very excited about having you all here with us today. This is a very special day for us. My name's Clark Shaw here, one of the storekeepers of the Old Country Store in the village here, and we're just delighted to have all of you here with us today. This very, very special day, the 100th anniversary of the Casey Jones story. This is just an incredible occasion for us here. It's April the 30th, 2000, as we mark the 100th anniversary of the Casey Jones story. To us, of course, it's a once-in-a-lifetime event, because it was 100 years ago this very day, and this date, April 30th, 1900, at 3:52 in the morning, that a new American legend and folk hero was born. It's a legend that we know today as Casey Jones, who was a Tennessean who called Jackson, Tennessee, home. It just so happens that I woke up this morning in the middle of the night. I guess I had a lot on my mind, and I woke up right around 3:52. I woke up about 3:45, and I knew it was about that time, and I just lay there a few more minutes wide awake, and my watch came to 3:52, and I just wondered exactly what was taking place 100 years ago at that very moment, and as we think about what we're here to honor today. But it was a tragic train wreck 100 years ago at that moment. There was a tragic train wreck out of which came a celebration of sorts, a celebration of life, of a song, and then of a wondrous legend that's known literally today around the world. And that's why we're here today, and I hope the next 45 minutes or so are going to be very meaningful to you as they are to us, because we think that Casey Jones embodies so much of what our nation, America, is all about and what's good about it. He's a symbol of the dedication to his family, a devoted husband and father, a great American work ethic of courage and daring and sacrifice, of staying at your post even at the cost of your own life. and to save those of others. And these are the noble characteristics our nation was founded on, and that we honor here today in this modest little white frame house right behind us here that Casey and his family called home. As you know, the Casey Jones Home and Railroad Museum is owned by the citizens of Jackson, Tennessee, and managed under the direction of our company, the Old Country Store. And on behalf of our family and our family of employees and our officers, Ann Shaw, and stand up, mother, that's my mother, Ann Shaw, Norwood Jones, Deborah Shaw Lehman, museum director and co-owner Lawrence Taylor. Lawrence, where's Lawrence? Here. It's just an honor and a privilege, very much, for us to be here and a part of this this whole museum. Let me also say that the last couple of years have been just very, very exciting ones as we have planned this event. And there's been just tremendous response from around the whole nation to the story. Just there's so much that's happened. We can't go into everything that's been done so far to tell this story again, but just a few highlights. Last week in last Sunday's paper of the Chicago Tribune, and I have a copy of it here, there's a full-page story, 2 pages, on the story of Casey Jones. It's also syndicated to 300 newspapers around the country, and it was on their internet as well. Trains Magazine, one of the nation's premier train publications for the enthusiasts, did a cover story and 10-page article on Casey Jones. Tom Savio with Railfan Magazine is here today from Los Angeles covering this event. And Tom, we're delighted to have you and Uncle Lou Schuyler. Where is Tom and Uncle Lou? There he is. Tom Savio from Los Angeles is here. Uncle Lou, there's Uncle Lou right here. Delighted to have you with us too. By the way, Uncle Lou's chief engineer of the Napa Valley Railroad in Napa, California. Beautiful wine country out there, and if ever you're out there, Uncle Lou will be glad to take you for a ride on the Napa Valley Railroad, which he's been an engineer for 50 years this year. That's something really great. Uncle Lou, glad to have you with us today. We've been on the guest on 2 coast-to-coast radio talk shows this week. Also, Paul Harvey, if you heard Paul Harvey on Friday, did a rest of the story on Casey Jones. In Europe, he's in a media blitz right now that's going on in Europe to 300 newspapers, magazines all around the country there too. So a lot of very, very exciting things are happening. And what's so exciting too is, like the Chicago Tribune and everywhere else, Dateline, Jackson, Tennessee. And that's what it's all about as far as being a part and serving our community. But it's very, very exciting. Our friend Doug Vire with ProLink and DeLamar Productions is here videotaping this, and as he videotapes it, this tape is going to be sent by satellite later this afternoon to an organization called CONUS, and they're going to send these proceedings to 105 television stations all across America, and we're very, very excited about that as well. It's also been a lot of long hours. In fact, I was at the dinner table with my son and my family last week, and my son said, because it's been a lot of time away from home, a little more than we'd like to spend, and he said, "Daddy, no more big ideas. You know, so we've had enough of those for right now, and let's just take a break." But this has been very exciting for us.
Ben Langford was a member of the Jackson, Tennessee City Council when the Casey Jones Museum was getting off the ground.
I can recall, I'm 76, I don't mind my age. I can recall about 70 years ago that first thing that I learned, of course, was the alphabet and the count to 100, taught to me by my mother before I entered kindergarten at the age of 4. But I can remember the first 4 or 5 things that I memorized: the Lord's Prayer, National Anthem, Pledge of Allegiance, 23rd Psalm, and Casey Jones song. I memorized all of those. And even though I am 76, I know them all today. I can still count to 100, even though it was taught to me. But I'm pleased to be here today because that was my first encounter with Casey Jones. And when I was elected commissioner of the city of Jackson in '55, George Smith walked across the hall one day, as he usually did every day or two, coming up with some ideas. Some of them were good, some were not so good. But I was his feeler, I guess. And he mentioned, we should do this. And I immediately agreed with him because this was a railroad town. I know when I came to Jackson in 1940 as a 16-year-old in a university, I found out quickly that I should not talk about Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so because they were related to everybody else. This was a strong railroad town, and I thought it would be great for Jackson for its people as well as the world. And I'm certainly happy that we made that decision to build it. We had an excellent committee to actually form the museum, led by Judge Leroy Pope. Charles Jones was on that committee and contributed immeasurably to it. We had Kirby Jones. We had several good members that met many evenings putting this thing together. And the best thing we did with the Casey Jones Museum was to get Norwood Jones and Clark Shaw and Taylor Lawrence to take it over in '77 because, as Mayor Farmer said, we were losing money, and they took it over, and it's just been going up ever since. And I want today to express my appreciation to these gentlemen and their families for doing such an outstanding job.
Former Mayor Bob Conger was also instrumental in the growth of the project.
My mother died in September of 1936. I was 8 years old. I didn't have any heat in my room. My parents had a little chill chaser in their room, gas chill chaser. And on those cold nights, and there were some very cold, in that first winter after my mother died, in the winter of 36, 37, my father would let me come in and get in bed with him where there was a little bit of heat in the room. My nose wouldn't be quite so cold when I went to sleep. And as we lay in bed, he would tell me about the railroad. And he told me all of the things that he remembered about it. He, of course, was a locomotive engineer, and before that, a locomotive fireman. Now, this is the part that I want you to either verify or support, and you don't have to do it publicly. You can whisper it in my ear after it's over. He told me that there were 3 brothers, that John Luther had 2 brothers. All 3 of them were from Casey, Kentucky, and all 3 of them went by the name of Casey because they worked in different places. My daddy said he fired an engine for all 3 of those Casey Joneses. Now, there's a phrase in the song, George, where'd George go? He left. Well, there's a phrase in the song that said you could tell by the sound of the whistle's moans that the man at the throttle was Casey Jones. Well, my daddy told me that was true, that each engineer, back before the book of rules got specific on the way you had to blow your whistle, each engineer had his own signature that he blew the whistle. And my daddy would lie in bed and cup his hands over his mouth and blow those whistles. And he would tell me which whistle was which, and he remembered them very clearly. He also told me that before the days of telephone, the way the crew got called to work was a caller. And there's a verse in that song that says the caller called Casey at 4:15 and he kissed his wife at the kitchen door. Well, that was a true picture of what took place in those days. They didn't call the crew and tell them the train was on time or 10 minutes late. They sent a caller. Caller went to the house, got the engineer, and the engineer went to the train and got on the train. So I know from my personal experience that railroading is a real deep and meaningful part of the history of Jackson, Tennessee.
Speaking for Casey's descendants was Charles House, Casey's great-grandson.
I want to talk and focus on the emotions that were going on about 3:52 a.m. on April 30th, 1900. Casey was working out of Memphis. It was about 10 o'clock that night, April 29th to be exact. Casey and his fireman Sim had finished their run to Canton, Mississippi and back. They had checked out and were prepared to go home. Another engineer called in sick. Casey and Sim volunteered to double back, take the next run of the Cannonball to Canton. The yard crew hooked 382 to the train, and around midnight, in the rain, they headed out southbound. Now it's about 3:50 a.m., April 30th. Casey and Sim are 2 or 3 miles north of the station at Vaughn. It's raining and foggy. They're running about 75 miles an hour. At that point, the track makes a long curve to the left. Seated on the right-hand side of the engine Casey cannot see down the track because the engine blocks his view. Sim Webb had just finished firing the engine and had taken his seat on the left-hand side of the cab. He looks down the track, and I wasn't there, but I know it must have been a second's hesitation. He sees two red dots off in the distance. He hesitates and he says to himself, "What the heck is that?" And suddenly he realizes it's two red lanterns on the back of a caboose. He screams at Casey, "There's a train on the main line." Instantly, Casey jumps to the other side of the cab, looks down the line to see how far ahead. Back to the other side, throttle down, throw it in reverse, throttle back up, dump the sandboxes on the track to increase the friction between the wheels and the track. Lay back on that brake lever for all you're worth and lock it. Back to the other side, take another look. Oh my God, we're not going to make it. She's slowing down, but we're going to wreck. Sim, we're going to crash. Jump. Jump now. Sim jumps. Casey is alone. Now it's this moment, frozen in time, that I want you to remember, and I want to analyze that moment. Casey has already physically done everything he can to stop that train, and it's not going to be enough. He has a decision to make. Sim just went over the gangway. We know today that Sim survived the jump to tell the story for many years. The odds are highly favorable that if Sim survived, then Casey would have survived if he had jumped and likely been home with Janie and his 3 children that same day. But there were people on that train up ahead. There's a crew, and the crew normally slept in the caboose. Not that they were definitely there, but there was also people, a crew and passengers on Casey's train. I can feel Casey's emotions as I'm standing here. His adrenaline had to be pumping wide open. Broke out in a cold sweat. The hair on his neck standing on end. Heart in his throat, stomach in a knot. What do I do? Instantly, Casey makes the right decision. Those people have to be warned. They have to be given their best chance for survival. Casey lays down on that whistle cord and puts every ounce of over 6'4", 200 pounds into getting just a little bit more leverage on those brakes. Try to minimize whatever's going to happen. Well, we all know it wasn't enough, and that's why we're here. But I would suggest to you that that point in time is where a legend was born, and that point in time is where a hero was made. That's what I want you to remember about Casey Jones.
As you roll across the trestle, spanning Jordan's swelling tide.
Finally, it was my turn to take the podium. I was there to talk about Casey, but to also honor him by presenting several variations of the Ballad of Casey Jones. Presidents and poets have spoken about Casey Jones. He has been written about in magazines. His name has been the focal point of countless stories. In 1981, when Ronald Reagan was president, he said, quote, "Casey Jones was a real-life hero. He wasn't made up. His story of courage and self-sacrifice is known by nearly everyone. Casey Jones is a shining example for working men and women. The Casey Jones legacy is indeed a wonderful one." Here's a quote, and then I'll tell you who said it. "I consider the Ballad of Casey Jones one of the greatest ballads ever written on the North American continent." That was said by Carl Sandburg. Casey's wife, Janie, who never got married again, by the way, and wore black most of her life in mourning, said Casey was just a lovable guy, 6'4", dark-haired, gray eyes, always in a good humor. His Irish heart was as big as his body. All railroaders were fond of Casey, and as we know, the man who admired him so much, Wallis Sanders, who cleaned trains, worshipped the ground he walked on, and it was Sanders who coined the Ballad of Casey Jones. Casey Jones historian and author Bruce Gerner said in his book, Casey Jones and the Wreck at Vaughan, quote, "You just have to understand how much Casey Jones loved his job, his engine, and the railroad. Then you'll know why Casey Jones didn't jump." In 1939, Casey Jones' official biographer, Fred Lee, said, "One name radiates the spirit of American adventure and the railroad, and that is Casey Jones." And a hero of mine, America's best-loved newsman, Paul Harvey, during his national broadcast said, "For it was on that day in 1900 near Vaughn, Mississippi, that Casey Jones could have jumped, but he didn't. He held his break to the last. He died, and a legend was born. And now you know the rest of the story." One of the most famous magazines of our era, Life magazine, once did a feature story on Casey Jones, commemorating him as a legendary character on a par with Johnny Appleseed. Many of you today will remember I.B. Tigert, a Jackson resident, president and chairman of the board of the GM&O Railroad. He was responsible for restoring engine 382. And by the way, the next time you punch up 382 on your telephone, the letters spell "Don't underestimate Casey." Engine 382 was restored. He said back in 1950, "There are men whose thoughts and deeds are recorded in posterity, but few leave footprints on the sands of time. One of them is the engineer Casey Jones, and largely because of the ballad about him." Well, let's talk about the music as we wrap things up here. The story of Casey Jones was carried around the world in song. It was a simple ballad that became very complex. When I first visited here, I heard a woman singing it with a German accent. And I asked her, "Why do you know this song?" And she said, "Well, I grew up in Germany, and it was in our songbook in German when I was a child." Laster's Bluegrass Band.
Come all you rounders if you want to hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was a rounder's name. On a big 8-wheeler, boys, he rode to Spain. Casey Jones, push out the throttle. Casey Jones, brave engineer. Come on, Casey, blow out the whistle so they all can hear. Casey Jones, push out the throttle. Casey Jones, brave engineer. Come on, Casey, blow out the whistle so they all can hear. Casey Jones, push out the throttle. Casey Jones, brave engineer. Come on, Casey, blow out the whistle so they all can hear.
I love hearing that bell ring, don't you? Let's give some applause for the bell, whoever's over there ringing it right now. Well, we've heard Casey Jones' ballad performed in a lot of different ways. How about Dixieland? It, of course, became famous in Memphis, which is a whole wonderful story about jazz there, and then went to New Orleans. Charles Huffman now and the Dixielanders.
In the traditional style of Dixieland, we are playing this arrangement that Mr. Huffman has arranged. It's in the style of a Dixieland funeral march, where participants would march toward the funeral home to a very slow, sad type of music, and on the way back, that's when it all cut loose. Here we go, Casey Jones. Big arrow, big arrow, big arrow. Ready? A one, a two, a one, two.
After the ceremonies, I talked to a modern-day railroad engineer named Bill about the still-present hazards of railroading.
Well, it is a dangerous profession. In fact, 6 engineers have been killed already in the last 6 months. And you don't really concentrate on the dangers when you're running a train if you're confident. If you're confident and you know what you're doing, it'll take care of itself. You try to go through with every scenario that can possibly happen and think it through so you know what you do before you do it, just exactly like a pilot landing a jet on a carrier, because when the time comes, you don't have time to think about it. You have to have your mind already made up what you can do. Having said that, I think there are 2 situations that you know that you possibly can't get out of, and that's a burned out bridge with the rail still hanging with a clear block. If you go into it, the train's going to come in on top of you, or hitting a gasoline or explosive truck. But you don't think about that if you have confidence. And my idea of a good engineer is one who's operating a train that knows everything that's going on around him.
It's almost impossible for modern people to realize what a basic part of life trains were.
I think so. There's an amazing picture I have at home of a train in Jackson, Tennessee, about 1899, with a stagecoach backed up to it. And people are getting off the stagecoach to get on the train. And that, as you say, that's the way it was, and that's the only way people could travel. And of course, train travel back then was extremely dangerous, and it has gotten safer and safer. I think the new trains in Europe, the TVGs, have carried some 7.5 billion passenger miles without a fatality or an accident.
It's also difficult for us today to understand what it meant when the railroad came to a town. That suddenly, it wasn't just that you could get on the train and go to San Francisco in a couple, 3 days rather than a couple months, but it actually began to change the town, didn't it?
Actually, the railroads didn't come to the town, the railroads built the town. And as the railroads expanded, particularly out west, they built a town and then expanded and built another town and expanded and built another town, and then those towns gave them the produce and the freight business to go ahead and expand more, and the people and they built hotels and that. In fact, the railroads, as they did that, and they had to keep on schedule, the railroads then came up and designed the time zones. It became time zones throughout the world so that the trains could run on time.
The gentleman's name was Fisher, I think, who spearheaded that. I'm trying to remember the story, but suddenly you would go from one town to another, and towns wanted to keep time by sundials, saying that was God's time. But yet, if you look at the Eastern time zone, theoretically, it's the same time in Calais, Maine, as it is in Terre Haute, Indiana, and it just doesn't work that way.
It just won't work out. I've always said you have a real problem when you start running trains if you try to run 2 trains over the same piece of track in opposite directions at the same place at the same time. It just won't work. And those times, without the time zones, that was happening pretty often.
One final thing. What is the lesson that we learn from Casey Jones and that incident? His heroism? Is it a simple story?
I think it's a simple story of that. I think Casey Jones went to this place possibly looking and having a sixth sense feel that I know it's happened to me many times, and had the brakes set. Had he not, he would have hit that park train at a very high speed, and maybe 100 people would have been killed. As it was, no passenger was even injured. And I think good engineers often do things like that. And I think Casey Jones, all the records show he was an exceptional engineer and was an exceptional person. A lot of the folks want to say he was an ordinary man thrust into history. There was nothing ordinary about Casey Jones.
I managed to spend a few moments with Casey's granddaughter, Nancy House.
My daddy never talked about him very much, and my grandmother didn't either. She just always called him my husband. She never said Casey.
Looking back at the house there, I wonder who did knock on the door and give her the news. Do we know that?
I've never heard that. I've never heard. I wonder who would know.
Because they likely didn't have, even though there were telephones, most people in 1900 still didn't have a phone.
I remember my father saying that somebody came to school. He was at school, at St. Mary's School. He was 12 years old, and somebody came and got him and brought him home, but I don't remember who.
What does it feel like to be able to come here to the Old Country Store and the museum and everything, and people may recognize or they find out who you are, particularly young kids? What kinds of questions do they ask?
Oh, I enjoy it. I really enjoy talking to people, and they want to know all about Casey Jones and everything he did. You know, I wish we could have known him. That's the only other thing I have.
But you got a photograph. A lot of people don't even have that.
Yeah, but you know, he must have had a lot of humor about him and been fun to be with. And of course, I always say that to me, he was a hero because he saved everybody but himself.
I also talked to Casey's great-grandson, Charles House, about his famous family member.
There is no emotion to text read from a book. The only way to experience the actual moment or try to be part of it is to have someone tell it to you and to have someone inject emotion into it. And the story of Casey Jones is just so emotional when you actually do analyze what happened, what was going on at the time, and there's just no better way to experience it.
Now, how did this lady sitting here explain this to you when you got old enough to understand what was going on?
I wish I could say I remembered. I do not remember.
It's just kind of always there for you, I guess.
Well, the first memory I have of Casey Jones is after school, waiting for Mother to get off work to go home. I would hang out at the museum in its original location in downtown Jackson. And you know, with time to kill, became familiar with everything, and would even, you won't get me in trouble if I tell this, will you? I would jump the fence around the locomotive and climb up in the cab in the old location.
So if we learn nothing else about Casey Jones during the centennial, we learned that Casey was a hard-working, likable family man who went to church, paid his dues, and would eventually give his life in a split-second decision that has become one of the most remembered moments in American history.
Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, Casey Jones, orders in his hand, Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, took a farewell trip to the promised land.
The engines glistened black and wet in the Memphis train yard as Casey Jones made his way toward engine number 382. He took a deep breath of the damp night air and lifted his feet from out of the fog as he climbed aboard his train. Casey greeted his fireman, Sim Webb. Sim responded with a smile. Together, the men turned their eyes to the south and headed out into the late night of April 29, 1900. Though neither knew it, in the darkness of that southern night, a legend lay, waiting to be born. The engine moved swiftly through the night with Casey at the helm, a man and a machine with a mission. Casey urged the train forward, his hand a constant pressure on the throttle. His eyes swept the dark, fast-moving landscape around him, and his heart rose to the thrill of the train as it rumbled over the tracks. With the familiar sound of the ride filling his ears, Casey knew he was a true railroad man. He was the engineer he had dreamed of becoming. Like the beginnings of most great men, Casey's arrival in the world was one without fanfare. On March 14, 1863, in the midst of the long Civil War, he was born Jonathan Luther Jones. Luther, as his family called him, was 13 years old when his family moved to the small Kentucky town of Casey. He had never before seen the railroad. And fascinated with the size and the speed of the trains and the sheer magic of the rails, Luther fell in love with the railroad and set his path for the future. At the tender age of 15, he joined the Mobile and Ohio Railroad as a telegrapher. When questioned about his origins, Luther replied that he hailed from Casey, Kentucky. He was thus christened Casey, after his hometown. The shy but clever young man would climb aboard the engines and explore them with a delicate, almost reverent touch. The desire to become an engineer was one of those powerful machines filled him night and day with anticipation and longing. He could just picture himself stationed at the engineer's post, his hand on the throttle, flying fast and free along the rails. The excitement of the railroad called to Casey's adventurous spirit, and he yearned to make his mark as an engineer. Well, Casey drew a step closer to his dream when in 1881 he was given the position of brakeman on the runs out of Columbus and Jackson, Tennessee. In Jackson, he met the young Janie Brady, who with her soft brown hair, shining eyes, and gentle smile left him speechless. When his work took him away from Jackson, Casey found his exhilaration at being on the railroad tempered with his longing to return to Janie. In 1886, the handsome young Casey Jones asked Janie to be his wife. Over the next 2 years, Casey found himself drawn to the prosperous and powerful Illinois Central Railroad, and in 1888, he joined the ICRR. In 1890, Casey became an engineer and ran a route between Jackson and Water Valley, Mississippi. Well, he grew accustomed to rushing along the rails with his head out the window to watch the drivers roll, a look of delight etched on his face and the thrill of the ride shining in his eyes. Casey honed his skills as an engineer and became known as one of the best on the rails. He was often recognized for his ability and desire to keep on schedule and to always bring his train in on the advertised. Well, in 1900, this skill and speed brought Casey to Memphis, Tennessee. He was assigned to be an engineer on one of the ICRR's newest runs, the Cannonball Express. The route was filled with dangerous stretches and curves, and many engineers avoided it for the sake of their own safety. And Casey had no doubt he could master the tricky route at the high speeds required. He began to make the runs on the Cannonball Express in February of 1900. One April night, Casey and his fireman Sims had just reached Memphis after completing a run of the northbound Cannonball. Casey's next run was not scheduled until the next night. However, the engineered schedule to take the southbound Cannonball run had taken ill. Casey agreed to take the run. He had only to wait for the southbound from Chicago to arrive. Now, that train was late arriving at the Poplar Street station in Memphis, and it placed Casey an hour and a half behind schedule. Undaunted, Casey boarded his engine and joined Sims in the cab. Now, convinced that he could make up for lost time, Casey maneuvered the rushing passenger train through the murky night. Engine number 382 went quickly over the tracks and moved deeper and deeper into Mississippi. The surrounding night was black and wet. Clouds hung low in the moonless sky, and the fog rose upward from the ground in white waves. The engine reached speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour as Casey flew over the rails. "The old girl's really got her high-heeled slippers on tonight," he yelled at Sims over the roar of the engine. With a supposedly clear track ahead, Casey was only 2 minutes behind schedule when he neared the small town of Vaughn, Mississippi. In Vaughn, trains were being sidelined to allow Casey to pass. But one train suffered a broken air hose and could not completely clear the track. 4 cars remained on the main line, directly in the path of engine number 382. Unaware, Casey continued to speed down the track. As the engine rounded the curve at Vaughn, Sim Webb, peering through the fog, spotted the red lights of the stranded train's caboose. Fear slid its cold fingers along his spine as he turned to Casey and warned him of the blockage. "Oh, my Lord," he cried, "there's something on the main line." Well, Casey threw on the air brakes and yelled, "Jump, Sims, jump!" With a final look at his friend, Sims leapt from the train and tumbled safely into the darkness. With a certain death ahead, Casey remained true to his calling and did not abandon the engine. Doing all he could to slow the train, Casey barreled down the track toward the stalled train. At 3:52 a.m. on the morning of April 30th, 1900, engine 382 exploded into the waiting cars. The powerful collision shattered the quiet of the early morning hours and echoed across the Mississippi countryside. The deadly embrace of the trains filled the air with the roar of splintering wood and twisting metal. Engine 382 left the tracks, plowing itself into the muddy embankment. The rest of the train remained safely on the rails. Casey Jones was the only person killed. He lay as still as his dark, twisted engine under the cloud-laden sky. The heroic actions Casey took that night saved the lives of all his passengers and his crew. With the knowledge that his own life would be lost and all he loved left behind, Casey willingly gave up his life for others. Now, Wallis Sanders was an African-American engine wiper who had known Casey Jones. Though he was nearly illiterate, Wallis would make up tunes and sing them to himself as he worked. He was touched deeply by the death of the engineer he had long considered to be his friend, and as he worked, Wallis sang a song of Casey Jones. Now, the railroaders who passed in and out of the roundhouse where Wallis worked caught the tune and began to carry it with him up and down the rails Casey had ridden. Over the next few years, the ballad became extremely popular, becoming a bestseller by World War I. In the simple words of a simple song, the story of Casey Jones came to be shared with the world, creating a legend and a place in history for the bright-eyed boy who became a gallant engineer.
Come all year rounders if you want to hear a story about a brave engineer. Casey Jones was his name. On the icy road he won his fame. The man called Casey about 10:30. Gotta make a run to Canton again. Mounted to the cabin with his orders in his hand. Took a farewell trip to the promised land. Casey Jones, two locomotives are gonna bump. Casey was found in the wreck, one hand on the whistle and one on the brake. A good engineer and very brave, he saved the passengers but died with the train. All kinds of heartaches, all kinds of pain, they all ride along on a railroad train. Stories of brave men, noble and tall, the greatest of them all was Casey Jones. Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, Casey Jones, orders in his hand, Casey Jones, mounted to the cabin, took a farewell trip to the promised land.
I'm Dennis Daly. On behalf of everyone at Casey Jones Village and the Old Country Store in Jackson, Tennessee, I say thank you and remind you to keep the memory of Casey Jones alive and bright for future generations.